Nobody's ever asked you for the most expensive thing you hand over. And you know the exact moment it happens. Somebody makes a comment about your work, not a criticism, just a passing comment. And you're 11 words into explaining yourself, before you notice that nobody actually asked you anything. That's it. That's the whole thing, happening several times a day, every week, for about 20 years, and you've never once been asked for any of it. But here's what makes it strange, because there was never a request. There was never a moment where you could have said no. So how do you catch yourself doing something nobody asked you to do? You don't. That's the problem. And it's why this has been running untouched since you were about 25. There's 6 of them. I'll run them smallest to largest, the orders by time. The first one covers a single sentence, and the last one covers your entire working history. And they get worse as we go, because the longer the stretch of your life a disclosure covers, the more of your future gets priced against it. And before anybody types it, let me kill the wrong reading. This isn't a video about being secretive. A man who volunteers nothing is exhausting to work with. Everybody quietly roots around him, and he never finds out, because nobody explains that to him either. Disclosure isn't the problem. Disclosure is how work gets done. The problem is unasked disclosure, and those two things get confused constantly, because honestly, from the outside they look identical. Last week, we priced the things people take from you. But that whole video assumed a request exists somewhere. This one's about what leaves when nobody asks at all, and it's why your rate keeps resetting, no matter how carefully you price the visible stuff. Machiavelli spent a chapter arguing about fortresses and whether they're worth what they cost to build. One line of it lands here without any adjustment. He said the best fortress isn't made of stone, and a ruler who defends walls, while ignoring what people actually think of him, has bought an expensive thing that solves the wrong problem. Sound familiar? You're guarding results, and you're guarding credit, and meanwhile, the gates are wide open on the thing that actually matters. 2 words in the comments before we start. Nobody asked. Type it, then keep it somewhere, because it's short enough to arrive in your head mid-sentence, and mid-sentence is the only place it's any use. 1. You give away your reasoning unprompted several times a day. Somebody asks what you decided. You tell them what you decided, and then, without pausing, you tell them why. The constraint you were working around, the 2 options you weighed, what you'd have done with another week. Catch the shape of that. The question was what, you answered what and why, and the why was free. So what does that actually cost you? A conclusion's a fact, and facts are hard to argue with. But reasoning is a structure, and structures have joints, and a man who can see your joints can lean on one of them without ever touching your conclusion. He doesn't have to beat your decision at all. He just has to find the weakest of your 4 reasons and push there, and suddenly you're defending a sub-clause in front of people who'd already accepted the decision. You didn't lose because your reasoning was poor. You lost because you handed it over. And there's a study that makes this worse than it sounds. In 2002, 2 researchers at Yale asked people how well they understood ordinary things. A zip, a flush toilet. Everybody rated themselves fairly high. Then they were asked to explain, step by step, how the thing actually worked, and their ratings collapsed. Not because they'd learned anything, because explaining out loud is the moment the gaps become visible, and they become visible to you at exactly the same speed they become visible to everybody listening. Look it up under the illusion of explanatory depth, Rosenblit and Kyle. Every time you explain unprompted, you're running that experiment on yourself in public. And here's where I'm going to disagree with something almost everybody now believes. For about 15 years, we've all been told the same thing. Be transparent, be authentic, bring your whole self to work. Openness builds trust, and a man who holds things back has obviously got something to hide. I think that advice is half true, and the half nobody mentions is the half that costs you. Because here's a question worth sitting with. Why is it that the people who give that advice are almost always people who already have standing? Think about it for a second. When a man with authority is open about his reasoning, it reads as confidence, like he's letting you in. When a man without authority does exactly the same thing, the identical words, it reads as justifying himself. Same behavior, same sentence, completely different price. And the price depends entirely on who's doing the speaking. Authenticity isn't free at all. It's a luxury good, and it's priced according to what you already have. So no, I'm not telling you to be fake. I'm telling you that the man who advised you to be radically open was, in almost every case, describing what worked for him from a position you don't currently occupy. There's a second cost here that's quieter and much bigger. Reasoning given repeatedly turns into a model. After enough of it, nobody needs to ask you anything, because they can run you. They know which constraint you weight heaviest, which trade-off you always make. So the requests landing on your desk have already been shaped to fit your reasoning, which means you're being handed conclusions you were always going to reach. They feel like your own decisions, don't they? The move here is a comma. You answer the question that was asked, and then you stop at the end of it. If they want the reasoning, they'll ask. And when they ask, it's worth something, because somebody wanted it. I keep the why. One word before number 2. Did you explain your reasoning today to somebody who hadn't asked? Yes or no. That's the whole comment. I'm expecting a lot of yeses, and most of you only remembered it 30 seconds ago. 2. You give away where you stand, before standing there costs anything. A discussion opens, nothing's decided, and people are circling. And you say what you think, not because it was your turn, and not because anybody asked you, but because the room went quiet, and having a view felt like contributing. So here's what that actually does. The first stated position in a room is the one everything else gets arranged around. And that isn't a metaphor, it's measured. In 1974, Tversky and Kahneman spun a rigged wheel of fortune in front of people, then asked them a completely unrelated question about African countries in the United Nations. The people who watched it stop on a low number guessed low. The people who saw a high number guessed high. A figure everybody watched being generated at random still dragged their answer toward it. Look up anchoring, Tversky and Kahneman. Now think about what that does to the first opinion spoken in a meeting. It's also the only position anybody can attack for free, because every speaker after you gets to define himself against something. You put the target up, and you paid for it yourself. But the real damage isn't getting argued with. It's that you can't move afterwards. The guy who spoke fourth heard 3 positions, picked the gaps between them, and can shift as things develop, because he never committed early enough to be pinned. You committed in minute 2 on half the information, because 11 seconds of silence felt unbearable. Now, the obvious objection, and it's a good one. If you never speak early, aren't you just a man with no convictions, waiting to see which way the room goes? There's a name for that man, and nobody respects him. That's fair, but look at what actually separates the two. It's timing, not courage. A conviction stated when it costs you something is a conviction. The same conviction stated in the first 2 minutes, before anybody's proposed anything to disagree with, isn't brave. It's filling silence, and it reads as filling silence to everybody in that room, including the people who agree with you. Speak third, not last, because last is its own kind of hiding, and not first either. Late enough to hear the shape of the thing, early enough that it's still being decided. I take the position third, right? Stop for a second. Actually, do something for me first. Notice what's happening in your head right now. Some part of you has been quietly composing a reply to me. A qualification, an example from your own job, the thing you'd say if we were sitting across a table. Feel it? That's the machine, running on a video, with nobody asking you anything at all. In a meeting on Tuesday, it won't stay in your head. Right. There's something underneath both of those mechanisms, and it explains why you've never once caught yourself. Unasked disclosure has no trigger. Every other habit's got a moment attached to it. Somebody asks you something, you answer, and the question's the marker. You can find it afterwards, replay it, decide to do it differently next time. There's an event to work on, but this one. Nothing happened at all. A small gap opened in a conversation and you filled it, and filling a gap doesn't register as an action. So there's no memory of it and nothing to review. You genuinely can't recall doing it, and that's not denial. That's an honest man looking for an event that never took place. So how do you fix a habit that leaves no evidence? You don't use willpower, you use a question, asked in one specific place, and it's the same 2 words all 6 times. Did anybody ask? That's the whole tool. It manufactures the trigger the behavior's missing, and once the trigger exists, you can finally see the thing. And once you can see it, stopping it costs almost nothing. 3. You give away the state of your week. Somebody asks you for something, and before you answer, you narrate your load. Things are mad this week. I've got 3 deadlines stacked. I've got nothing on Thursday. Actually, both of those directions are disclosures, and both of them are expensive, which is the part that surprises men. Saying you're busy sounds like a defense, and it isn't one. It tells them your capacity is a variable rather than a decision, so it can be argued with, and it invites the reshape. Well, what about next week then? And now you're not discussing whether. You're discussing when, and whether was the only ground you were ever going to win on. Saying you're free is worse, and nobody guards it at all, because it removes the question of priority completely. A man with an empty Thursday has got no basis to decline anything that fits in a Thursday, and now everybody knows the Thursday's there. You've published your inventory. The move is to answer the request, not the calendar. Yes or no, or I'll come back to you by Thursday. 3 options, none of which says a word about your week. If somebody genuinely needs your capacity, they'll ask, and then it's a scheduling conversation with terms in it, not a giveaway. My week is not public. Give me a number before the next one. How many people at your work could accurately describe how you make decisions? 2, 9, all of them. Just the number and nothing after it, because the honest answers run a lot higher than the comfortable ones. Now, the thing I want you to see, because it's this entire video in one afternoon. Venice ran a shipyard called the Arsenal, and by the 1500s it was the biggest industrial operation in Europe. Thousands of workers inside one walled complex, building war galleys. What made it extraordinary wasn't the size, it was the method, standardized parts, and a moving sequence. A hull traveled down a channel past a line of stations, and at each station, a crew fitted the same component they fitted on every hull. So the ship got assembled in stages by specialists, instead of being built from scratch. It's a production line, centuries before anybody used the phrase, and it let Venice put ships in the water, faster than any rival could manage. Now, 1574. Henry III of France is travelling home to take his throne. He comes through Venice, and the Republic throws him a reception that's extravagant, even by their standards. At some point they sit him down for a banquet, and while he's eating, in full view, the Arsenal assembles a galley. By the accounts we've got, the ship was laid down, fitted out and floating by the time the meal ended. There's 2 decisions in that. Only one of them is obvious. The obvious one is that they showed him the result. They wanted a foreign king to walk away with one idea, which was that Venice could build warships faster than any enemy could sink them. A demonstration does that in an afternoon. 100 diplomatic letters wouldn't have, but the second decision is the one that matters to you. They showed him the ship, and they didn't show him the system. He watched an outcome. He got no tour of how the stations were sequenced, how the parts were standardized, how the workforce was organized. That stayed inside the walls, and Venice was severe about stopping the men who held it from taking it anywhere else. So, what did he actually walk away with? He walked away with an enormous impression of Venetian power and absolutely nothing he could use against them. Display the outcome, withhold the method. Now, which half of that do you do? And look it up rather than taking my word for it, because accounts of the timing vary, which is why I've kept it loose. 4. And this is the one men fight me on, so let's have it. You give away your ceiling, you say, in a tone of complete reasonableness, that you're not really a numbers person, that you've never been good at the political side, that presenting isn't your strength. You're better in writing, you wouldn't be right for anything client-facing. Every one of those is probably true, and that's not the issue at all. Because what actually happens to a stated limit? It doesn't get heard as self-knowledge at all. It gets filed as a constraint, and constraints get respected permanently by everybody, and nobody in the building ever goes back and revisits one. Solomon Asch showed how hard that file is to shift back in 1946. He read people's 6 words describing a man: intelligent, industrious, impulsive, critical, stubborn, envious. Then he read the identical 6 to another group in reverse, starting with envious. Same words. Completely different man came out the other end, and the only difference was which one arrived first. Whatever you said about yourself first is still doing that job. 18 months from now, when the thing that fits your limit exactly comes up, it'll go to somebody else. You won't be told. There'll be no meeting where anybody argues against you. Just a shared understanding, which you wrote yourself, that this isn't your area. And here's the thing. You'll have grown out of it by then, which is the cruel bit. Limits move, and men develop. But the file never updates, because nothing in an organization ever updates a file the subject wrote himself. Now, the argument against me, because it's a good one. You could say I'm asking a man to misrepresent himself. That knowing your weaknesses and saying them plainly is maturity, and the alternative is a guy who overclaims and then fails publicly. And we've all watched that happen. All of that's correct, and it doesn't touch the point, because this was never about lying. It's about who does the assessing. There's a difference between saying I'm not a numbers person, which is a permanent claim about your nature, and saying I haven't done much of that, which is a statement about the past that leaves the future open. Both of those are true, but one shuts a door and one doesn't. And if somebody genuinely needs to know whether you can do a thing, they'll ask you, and then you answer honestly and completely, because a request deserves the truth. So where's the actual failure? It's the unasked ceiling, the one you volunteer in a corridor, being self-deprecating about a skill nobody had even raised. You've probably done exactly that at some point this month, haven't you? I do not file my own limits. Stop for 20 seconds and do this properly. Name one limit you've said out loud about yourself in the last year. At work, when nobody asked. It'll come fast. It's almost always the same one, and you've probably said it a dozen times. Then the harder half, is it still true? Most men find it stopped being true somewhere between 2 and 5 years ago, and they've been walking around describing a man who doesn't exist anymore. And settle something for me, because this one splits people properly. Is a man who volunteers nothing about himself disciplined, or is he just difficult to work with? Half of you have watched a quiet operator get everything he wanted. The other half have worked with somebody who withheld so much that nobody could plan around him. Pick a side and tell me which, disciplined or difficult. 5. And the horizon jumps here, from a month to a year. You give away what you want, long before you're in any position to get it. Think about the last time you said something like this. You mention, in passing, that you'd like to run your own team eventually. That you've been thinking about the commercial side. That if the role ever opened up, you'd be interested. Feels harmless, doesn't it? It feels like initiative even, because how on earth would anybody know what you wanted unless you told them? Here's what it actually does. A stated ambition turns you from a colleague into a candidate, and it does it in everybody's head at once, in a version of the race where nothing started and there aren't any rules. From that moment, everything you do gets read against the ambition. Good work becomes positioning. A reasonable disagreement becomes a move, and anybody who wants the same thing now knows to watch you. And they knew before you had anything to defend. And what's the second effect? Uglier than the first. Ambition stated early gets priced as a request, and a request can be turned down without anybody ever saying anything, just by never happening. You'll never be told you were refused. You might spend 2 years waiting on a decision that got made in a corridor, the same week you mentioned it. So what's the correction? It isn't to want less, and it isn't to hide. It's sequencing. Build the thing that makes the ambition obvious, and let somebody else say it first. When a man's already doing 3/4 of a role, nobody experiences his promotion as ambition. They experience it as tidying up, and nobody resists tidying up, because agreeing costs them nothing. I want it quietly. 6. The biggest horizon, and almost nobody guards it, because it doesn't feel like disclosure at all. It feels like being human. You give away your history, the job that went badly, and everybody knew about it. The company you left under a cloud, the year you were struggling, the thing you got wrong early on that you now tell as a story against yourself. Because telling it against yourself is disarming. It puts people at ease, and it's genuinely a likable thing to do. Now, am I telling you to invent a past? No, a man with no history is uncanny, and people feel it. But here's the mechanism, and watch how it works. A story you tell about yourself becomes the permanent record. It doesn't decay. It doesn't get filed next to the 12 years of competence that came afterwards. It sits there on its own, and years later, somebody's deciding whether you're right for something difficult, in a conversation you're not in, and one detail from a story you told at a dinner in your 30s surfaces, repeated by a guy who wasn't even there. That's not malice on anybody's part, it's just how memory works. A specific vivid detail travels between people, and a general impression of competence doesn't. In 2001, Roy Baumeister and his colleagues went through decades of research and published a review with a title that says, "The whole thing. Bad is stronger than good. Across memory, impressions, relationships, the negative event weighs more and lasts longer, and it isn't close. So 12 years of solid work compresses into he's good. And one story about the year it went wrong stays at full resolution forever, in your own words, which makes it unarguable. So what's the rule? It's narrow. Volunteer none of it. Answer honestly if you're asked directly. Because lying about your history is a different and much worse problem, and a man who gets caught doing that never recovers. But don't offer it. Don't use it as social lubricant, and above all, don't tell it as a joke. Because a self-deprecating story is the most memorable form the information can take, and the form you've got least control over once it leaves you. My file stays closed. Name yours 1 to 6. The why, the position, the week, the ceiling, the ambition. the history. 1 digit, that's the whole comment. And you knew which one before I finished the list. I reckon 4 and 6 do the most damage, and most of you are going to say 1. Prove me wrong. Before the turn, the warning, because there's a version of this that wrecks a man. You could take all 6 and become somebody nobody can read. And it works for a bit. And then something starts happening that you won't ever connect to this video. Want to know what it is? People stop bringing you things. Not the requests, because those keep coming as normal. What stops is all the early stuff, the material that arrives before anything is decided. The half-formed idea somebody wanted a reaction to. The warning that something's about to change. The invitation to a conversation that hadn't become a plan yet. All of that runs on reciprocity. Reciprocity needs somebody to go first. And if you never go first, eventually nobody does. So where's the line? It's exact. These 6 are about unasked disclosure, not about generosity. Give freely when you're asked, and give completely when it's your job. And go first, deliberately, with the small handful of people you actually want a real relationship with, because with those people, it isn't a leak. It's the whole thing. Everybody else gets the answer to the question they asked. Now the turn, and it's not where you've been standing. You've been listening to this as a video about hiding more, haven't you? It isn't. It's about what you've chosen to hide, and you've got it precisely the wrong way round. Venice showed the ship and hid the system, so what do? Exactly the opposite. You hide your results, out of modesty, because claiming your own work feels like boasting, and boasting's the thing you were raised not to do. And you display your process constantly, freely, several times a day, to anybody standing near you, because explaining how you think feels like being open, rather than like being audited. So the room around you knows exactly how you operate, and has only the vaguest sense of what you've actually produced. And think about what those 6 actually are. Every one of them is a piece of the method. The reasoning, the position, the capacity, the limits, the wants, the past. That's your arsenal. And you've been running tours. Meanwhile, the outcome, the finished galley, the thing that would settle the whole question in one afternoon, stays behind the wall. Because showing it would feel immodest. And there's a second half, and it's harder. You're not informing anybody. You're auditioning. Look at when it actually happens. It's never when the information's needed, is it? It's when you feel slightly unaccounted for. A gap in a conversation. A meeting where you haven't spoken yet. A stretch of a week where nobody's needed anything from you. The pressure builds, out it comes. And afterwards, there's a small relief that's got nothing to do with the other person having learned anything. That relief is the tell, and it tells you plainly that you weren't transferring information. You were establishing that you exist in the room, and the reasoning, and the position, and the limits, and the ambition, and the history were just the material you had lying around to do it with. Every unasked disclosure is a job application, submitted to a panel that isn't hiring. And an application, by its nature, invites an assessment from whoever receives it. So you've been asking to be evaluated several times a day for 20 years by people who weren't evaluating you until you asked, and who now have 20 years of material to do it with. Nobody was assessing you, and you kept applying anyway. So what changes? 2 words. Before you volunteer anything about yourself, you ask, internally, did anybody ask? It isn't restraint, it isn't silence, and it isn't discipline. It's just a trigger, dropped into a habit that's never had one. And it works because the answer's almost always no, and almost nobody can finish a sentence after honestly answering no to that question. So what happens if you run it? Give it 2 weeks and you'll start noticing the gap right before the disclosure. And the gap turns out to be a physical feeling you've been having for 20 years without ever giving it a name. Once it's got a name, it stops being an order, and here's what arrives, which isn't what you're expecting. People start asking you things, because a man who doesn't volunteer becomes a man you have to consult. And consulting somebody is a completely different transaction from being briefed by him. It's the same information traveling in the opposite direction, and everything downstream of that reversal changes with it. Nobody asked 6 lines and they're yours now. Nobody asked, I keep the why, I take the position third. My week is not public. I do not file my own limits. My file stays closed. One of those cost you more than the other 5. Put it below with your number next to it, and I read all of them. And I want the argument as well. If you think I'm wrong about the transparency thing, say so, because it's the part of this I'd most like to be wrong about. You're one of the pack now, and the pack doesn't brief the room. Subscribe, because there's 3 more in this arc, and they're built in order. Next Thursday, there's a man in your building who says less than anybody, and ends up holding more than anybody, and you've assumed it's temperament. It isn't. Calm is a position, and it's the only position where information arrives before it's public, and decisions arrive before they're announced. Why the calm man ends up holding everything? That's next. Say it once more and mean it. Nobody asked. Somewhere the tour is still running,